No one trusts an Apache. "But I can cook, sir," said the woman. The rancher's action changed her life. The wind tore through Pecos Valley like a blade drawn across old bone. Inside the half-dark ranch house, Eliam Warren woke to the sound of it that long. Broken cries slipping through the wire fence as if the desert itself remembered what he had done. Sweat clung to his temples, though the air was dry. Somewhere in the distance, a shutter banged against the wall, each strike echoing like a drumbeat from another lifetime. He rose, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The night smelled of dust and smoke, the way it had years ago when he'd ordered a village burned because someone said it held enemies. He stared toward the low hills where the sky bled silver, listening, sometimes, in that thin hour before dawn. He swore he could still hear them, the voices of the Apache, crying not in anger, but in sorrow that never stopped burning. By the summer of 1880, Pecos Valley had turned the color of old copper. Days baked the ground until it cracked like pottery, and nights whispered through mesquite branches that rattled like bones in a drum. Nothing in that valley stayed soft for long, not the earth, not the cattle, not the hearts of men. Yet somewhere between the folds of dust and silence stood Coyote Bend Ranch, a lonely patch of fencing and faith clinging to the dry edge of a vanished stream. Eliam Warren had built it with his own hands when the war finally let him go. He was 40. His back still straight, but his spirit bent from too many orders followed and too many fires lit. A thin scar circled his left wrist, with faded rope marks from the day he'd hoisted the regimental flag over what used to be an Apache camp. At night, when the wind blew from the east, he still smelled the smoke of it. By day, Eliam worked as if salvation could be dug from the soil. He rode the fence lines alone, patched the roof when storms passed, and fixed the windmill though it no longer turned. His men respected him in that distant way cowhands respect the man who signs their pay. But no one dared to ask why he never joined their laughter. He ate alone, prayed in silence, and drank his coffee, black always black, as if sweetening it would be dishonest. Beyond the ranch, 20 miles west, the town of Silverton Crossing shimmered in the heat. It was a place of weathered porches, creaking saloon doors, and a single church that doubled as a shelter for anyone lost between God and hunger. That church, St. Luke's Mission, was where Eliam first saw her, Talina. She was standing in the courtyard beside an old padre of Mexican blood, her hands folded, her face turned toward the harsh noon sun without flinching. Her skin was copper brown like the land itself, and her hair fell in thick black ropes tied loosely with a strip of deerskin. The hem of her faded dress brushed the dusty ground. Patched in so many places, it looked like a map of survival. But it was her eyes that made Eliam pause, dark, still, and wide as the rain wells dug by her people. There was no fear in them, only watchfulness, the kind of calm that comes after everything else has been taken. Father Romero said she'd been found near the reservation border, half-starved, walking toward the mission after a raid. She refused charity, asked only to work. She doesn't beg, the padre told him softly. She earns. When Eliam asked whether she was afraid of working among whites, Talina's reply came quiet but unyielding. Those who fear me have done enough fearing for us both. I know nobody wants to trust me, but I can cook, and I can work. Her words struck him like grit in a wound. For the first time in years, something other than regret moved inside him, a small flicker. Uncomfortable, but alive. He could have walked away then. He should have. But the wind carried the scent of sage and ashes, and something in it told him that the past would never loosen its hold unless he faced it head on. That evening, he signed her on as cook for Coyote Bend Ranch. By dawn, the rumor had already crossed Silverton's saloon counters, for Warren hired a reservation runaway. Laughter rolled through town like thunder over dry hills. Eliam didn't answer it. He only looked toward the rising sun where the desert gleamed hard and endless, and wondered if redemption ever began with a single, foolish act of kindness. The next afternoon, the sun hung high and mean above Silverton Crossing. Eliam tied his horse outside St. Luke's Mission, dust rising around his boots like smoke from a dying fire. The church stood low and whitewashed. Its bell cracked, its courtyard filled with the faint scent of mesquite blossoms and old prayers. Inside, Father Romero moved quietly between benches, his brown robes trailing like shadows. "She's in the back," the padre said, "preparing bread for the orphans. She doesn't speak much, but she listens. You'll see." Eliam nodded and stepped through the arched doorway into the kitchen. The air was heavy with the smell of cornmeal and wood ash. Talina stood by the clay oven, sleeves rolled to her elbows, pressing dough with the slow rhythm of someone who had done it all her life. She didn't turn when he entered, though she must have heard his boots scuff against the floor. "I hear you're looking for work," he said finally. She looked up. Her eyes met his, dark and unreadable, for a heartbeat. He thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice calm and steady, "I'm not looking. I've found it." Eliam frowned slightly. "You mean here, where there is food to make and mouths to feed? There is work." She wiped her hands on her apron, then added, "But Father Romero says I should leave soon. Some people don't like my face near the church doors." He shifted uncomfortably. "You'd be treated fair at my place. It's a ranch out by the old Pecos bed." Her gaze lingered on him, weighing the truth in his tone. "Why would a man like you need a woman like me?" It wasn't defiance, it was caution, the kind born from too many betrayals. Eliam didn't have a clean answer. He only said, "Because no one else could stand the quiet there." She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Quiet doesn't frighten me." The conversation ended there. Neither offered a smile. They didn't shake hands. The silence between them felt less like distance and more like recognition, the faint, dangerous kind that unsettles before it soothes. When she stepped outside to gather her few belongings, the light struck her face full on, turning her eyes to liquid amber. Eliam noticed the faint scar at the edge of her jaw, thin as a thread of smoke. He wondered what kind of life had carved it. As they rode out of Silverton, the town's murmurs followed them. Warren's "lost his mind" brought a red girl home. Some laughed, some spat. Talina kept her gaze forward, her posture straight as a spear shaft. By the time they reached Coyote Bend, dusk had painted the valley in shades of rust and violet. The ranch hands were waiting by the corrals, curiosity sharp in their eyes. One of them, a broad man named Pike, muttered, "Hope she don't hex the stew." A few others chuckled. Talina said nothing. She stepped down from the horse, walked past them, and went straight into the kitchen. A moment later, smoke rose from the chimney, the first kitchen fire that ranch had seen in months. Eliam stood on the porch, listening to the faint clang of pans inside. The men lingered awkwardly until the smell of roasting corn drifted through the yard, rich and warm. "Guess the witch cooks fine," someone murmured. Eliam didn't answer. He watched the light flicker against the window where she moved, a silhouette framed by fire, and felt, for the first time in years, that something restless inside him had quieted. For the first week, the ranch hands kept their distance. They spoke low when Talina passed, spat near her shadow, and laughed too loudly when she walked away. Eliam said nothing. He knew men didn't change by command, but he watched. And so did she. Every morning before dawn, smoke began to rise from the kitchen chimney. By the time the others stumbled out from their bunks, the smell of frying salt pork and coffee already filled the yard. Talina's fire never faltered. Even when the desert wind howled through the gaps in the walls, she worked as if the world depended on each loaf of bread. The first man to soften was young Toby, barely 20. He had burned his arm fixing the forge, and Talina wordlessly wrapped it in yucca leaves soaked with water. "It'll draw the heat," she murmured. The next day, the burn stopped blistering. Toby nodded shyly when he saw her after that, and when someone sneered witch medicine, he didn't laugh along. Gradually, the others followed. The laughter turned into cautious greetings, then to small talk about cattle and weather. One evening, Pike, the same man who'd mocked her, came into the kitchen holding an empty plate. "That stew," he said gruffly, "tastes like something from home." Talina tilted her head. "Then your home was hungry." "Too," she answered, and ladled him another serving. Eliam often stood on the porch at twilight, leaning against a post while the smells of roasted corn and sage floated through the air. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard so much life in the place. The men's laughter no longer jarred him. Even the wind seemed to hum softer through the wire fences. Inside, Talina moved like part of the house itself, quiet, sure, shaping every corner into warmth. Yet she never crossed the line between duty and belonging. She spoke little, slept in a small room behind the pantry, and kept a small pouch of dried herbs above her bed. Once, Eliam glimpsed her whispering over it as if speaking to someone far away. One evening, after a long day of branding calves, Eliam found her sitting by the back steps, watching the horizon fade to blue. The air smelled of mesquite smoke and the faint sweetness of bread cooling on the sill. "You cook for men who once called you a curse," he said quietly. Talina didn't look up. Fire doesn't choose who it warms. He wanted to say something, an apology. Maybe, but the words tangled. Instead, he handed her a small tin cup of coffee. "It's bitter," he warned. She took it, sipped, and smiled faintly. "Good. Bitter keeps you awake." They sat in silence, the kind that stretches but doesn't break. In that moment, Eliam realized how long it had been since he'd shared quiet with someone without feeling haunted by it. Days turned into weeks. Talina taught the men to hang bundles of dried sage by the windows to keep snakes away. She showed Toby how to tell the direction of wind by the feel of dust on his tongue. When a newborn calf struggled to stand, she knelt beside it, whispering something soft in Apache until it rose, trembling but alive. At night, Eliam sometimes heard her humming in the kitchen, a low, mournful tune that felt older than the valley itself. It pulled him from his sleep, but not unpleasantly. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone the world had tried to break could carry such peace in her voice. Then came the night she fixed the roof. A summer storm had ripped half the shingles off, and Eliam found her outside in the rain, climbing the ladder barefoot, hammer in hand. "You'll fall," he shouted over the wind. She turned, rain streaking her face. "You built this place to stand. I won't let it fall for a little weather." He climbed up beside her, took the hammer from her hand. Their fingers brushed cold skin against warm, and for a second, the storm vanished. Only the sound of their breath remained. Later, when they came down soaked to the bone, she built a fire in the hearth to dry their clothes. The flames threw gold light across her face, revealing the faint scar along her jaw. Eliam found himself staring. She caught him. "What do you see?" she asked. He hesitated. A woman who's not afraid of storms. She smiled. The first true smile he'd seen. Then you're not looking close enough. The moment passed quickly, but it left something between them, a fragile warmth neither dared to name. By midsummer, Coyote Bend no longer felt like a graveyard of regrets. The cattle were strong. The men worked without grumbling. And every evening ended in the same ritual, a meal cooked over steady flames. A prayer whispered in two languages. Eliam began to think the ranch might finally be free of ghosts. He didn't know that somewhere beyond the valley, the wind was already carrying whispers from Silverton Crossing, rumors wrapped in jealousy, born from the mouth of a woman who once called herself his wife. And before long, that wind would find its way to their door. The rumors reached Silverton like wildfire, riding on gossip and whiskey breath. Beatrice Dunn, once Beatrice Warren, returned to town in a stagecoach creaking with her bitterness. Once a woman of beauty and perfume, she now wore resentment like rouge. The years had carved fine lines around her eyes that still burned at the mention of her former husband, when she heard that Eliam had taken in an Apache woman. The laughter in Dustwell Saloon turned sharp. Eliam Warren. That solemn fool, Beatrice scoffed. He wouldn't touch a woman for 10 years, and now he warms his bed with a red witch. It didn't take long before a few idle drunks and mean-hearted ranchers followed her lead. By dusk, a crowd had gathered outside the saloon, loud with heat and envy, in a place where drought and loneliness shaped every man's temper. All it took was a whisper of difference to make them cruel. At Coyote Bend, the afternoon burned slow and golden. Talina was kneeling in the garden patch she'd coaxed from dry dirt, pulling weeds from between the corn rows. The men were off in the pasture, and Eliam sat on the porch sharpening a blade, watching the horizon tilt into amber light. He saw the dust first rising from the south road like smoke. He squinted, then frowned as shapes emerged through the glare. Riders, 5 or 6 of them, their horses restless. At their front rode a woman in a green dress too fine for the road, her hat pinned high, her face hard as sun-dried clay. "Beatrice, stay inside," he told Talina, quietly. But she was already standing, wiping her hands on her skirt. Her face held no fear, only a calm resignation, as though she had seen storms like this before. The rider stopped at the gate. Beatrice swung down, boots sinking in the dust. "Well, well," she said, voice sweet as spoiled honey. "Didn't think I'd see the day when you'd rather keep company with savages than your own kind." "Eliam, this is my land," he said evenly. "You've no reason to be here." Her smile sharpened. "No reason? Oh, but I do. Folks deserve to know what's happening out here. Some half-breed devil woman brewing charms for decent men." She raised her voice, turning to the onlookers. "She's poisoned him. Can't you see? Look at her standing there like she owns the place." The men muttered, uneasy, half-drunk on her fury. One kicked open the gate. Another spat into the dust. Eliam stepped forward. "Turn your horses around and leave." Beatrice ignored him and marched toward the porch. "Or what? You'll shoot me? You wouldn't dare." Then, suddenly, she snatched a pot from the kitchen window, spilling the contents into the dirt. "What's this? Her potion?" "It's stew," Talina said simply. Beatrice turned, eyes flashing. "Liar. You think you can charm your way into his house?" "Into his heart." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack. Then Talina said, in that same calm voice, "I don't know magic. I only cook food that makes people want to live one more day." Something in her tones so gentle, it shamed their anger cut through the noise. Even the horses shifted uneasily. Beatrice, red with humiliation, turned on Eliam. "You're a fool. She'll ruin you. She'll make you lose everything." Eliam met her gaze, his voice low but steady. "I've already lost everything except the faith she brought back." For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then Eliam stepped between Talina and the mob, his stance solid, his revolver still holstered. "This ranch stands because of her. If you can't see that, then ride home before the sun sets. You'll find no devils here, only people trying to forget their sins." One by one, the men turned their horses. Beatrice stayed until the last of them disappeared down the trail. Her expression twisted between rage and disbelief. She spat into the dirt at Talina's feet. "You think you've won, little witch, but everything you touch will burn." Talina looked at her quietly. "Then let it burn," she said. "Fire makes new soil." Beatrice mounted and rode off, her hat trembling in the wind. The sound of hooves faded, leaving behind only dust and the smell of spilled stew. That night, the ranch was silent. The men worked without speaking. Eliam stood by the corral, his face caught between pride and exhaustion. Talina came to stand beside him, a thin shawl over her shoulders. "They'll talk," she said softly. "They always do," he replied. "Do you regret it?" He turned to her. "Hiring you?" She shook her head. "Standing for me?" "No," he said after a pause. "I think it's the first thing I've done that felt like standing at all." For a long while, they said nothing. The stars were fierce and close, the kind that made a man feel both small and forgiven. The desert wind carried the faint scent of rain far off, but the rain didn't come. 2 weeks later, the fever hit. At first it was one of the ranch hands, then 2, then 5, a sickness that curled the gut and stole the breath. The doctor from Silverton came, took one look, and left before sundown. "Nothing to be done," he said, tipping his hat. "Pray, if you believe in that sort of thing." Talina didn't pray, she worked. She gathered herbs from the hills: creosote, sage, prickly pear root. She boiled them in a blackened pot until the air filled with a strange, earthy scent. The men lay moaning in the barn. Eliam, pale with worry, tried to help, but she stopped him gently. "You can't carry the sickness for them," she said. "You can only carry the hope." She stayed awake 3 nights straight, tending the fevered, feeding them spoonfuls of broth. On the 4th night, when her own strength broke, she collapsed beside the fire. Eliam caught her before she fell. Her hands were burning. He carried her outside to the porch where the air was cool and the smell of wet dust lingered. Far off, thunder rolled. "You've done enough," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy. "No, the fire isn't out yet." He held her hand until the rain came soft, hesitant. The first rain Pecos had seen in months. The drops hit the roof like a heartbeat. When she finally slept, Eliam sat beside her through the night, his thumb tracing the calluses of her palm. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of fire consuming everything. He dreamed of fire being tended, watched, nurtured until it became warmth instead of ruin. At dawn, the fever broke, the men stirred, coughing weakly but alive. And when Talina awoke to see the rain falling steady over the land, she smiled. Eliam squeezed her hand. "You saved them," he said. Then, quieter, "You saved me. If I'm the fire that keeps this place alive," she murmured, "then you must be the roof that lets me stay." The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean. Over the horizon, the first light broke through a sky the color of forgiveness. When the fever was finally gone, the valley lay hushed beneath a thin veil of steam. The earth, soaked after months of thirst, gave off a scent of iron and sage that clung to the air. The men rose from their cots weak, but laughing small. Hoarse sounds of survival. None of them dared to speak Talina's name above a whisper, as if she were something sacred that might vanish if acknowledged too boldly. Eliam moved through the ranch like a man reborn. The ghosts that had haunted his nights no longer howled. They watched from a distance now, quiet and spent. Every time he passed the kitchen door, he heard the soft rhythm of Talina's hands working dough again. The sound made the place feel alive in a way he couldn't remember since before the war. One evening, when the sun slid low over the ridges, Eliam found her sitting beside the stream bed where the rainwater still glimmered in pockets of gold. Her shawl was draped loosely, her bare feet sunk in wet clay. He joined her wordlessly, lowering himself beside her. For a while, they simply listened to the crickets and the distant moo of cattle, both of them breathing as though afraid to disturb the stillness they had fought so hard to earn. "You've turned this place into something I almost don't recognize," he said finally. She smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's finally worth keeping." Eliam stared out over the valley. "You know what they used to call me in town, the burned captain? I earned it, the things I did." He stopped, swallowing the words like stones. "There are nights I still see the fires I ordered. I can smell them." Talina didn't look away. "My village burned, too," she said softly. "I was there. I remember a man shouting in English, a voice trying to sound brave. But it trembled. I hated that voice for years. Then one day I realized, hate makes you forget how to listen." Eliam turned to her slowly. "You—" She nodded once. "Yes, it was your soldiers." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. A lark trilled somewhere, then fell quiet again. He wanted to stand, to run, to disappear into the dust. But her gaze held him steady, not in accusation, but in recognition. She reached for the water, scooped a handful, and let it drip through her fingers. "I came here to survive," she said. "But I stayed because survival isn't enough. I stayed because even ashes can feed new fire." Eliam's throat closed. If forgiveness were something a man could beg for, it isn't begged for. She interrupted gently. "It's lived." The words settled between them like the last ember of a dying fire. Small, glowing, true. When he finally found his voice again, it was rough but lighter. "Then let me live it with you, if you'll let me." Talina looked at him for a long time. In her eyes he saw not pity, but strength and invitation to rebuild, not erase. "We'll see," she said at last. "Forgiveness grows like the desert rain, slow, but it comes." A breeze stirred, carrying the smell of mesquite smoke and wet earth. He reached out, hesitated, then touched her hand lightly. As one might touch a flame they no longer feared. She didn't pull away. They sat until the stars came out, the sky deep and endless. Eliam thought of how easily the world could have ended for both of them, and how quietly it had begun again instead. That night, before sleep took him, he passed the kitchen doorway. Talina was still awake, tending the small fire she'd built in the stove. The orange glow spilled across her face, and he realized something simple and absolute. The fire that once haunted him had found a gentler home. Outside, the land sighed beneath the cool breath of rain. The fences creaked softly. The windmill groaned back to life. In every corner of Coyote Bend, something stirred a pulse, a promise, the quiet rhythm of a place learning to live again. A full year passed before anyone realized what Coyote Bend had become. The drought never returned that summer, and grass grew where only dust had once lived. Travelers along the Pecos Trail began stopping by for water or rest and stayed for something more. From the kitchen that Talina had rebuilt with her own hands came the smell of roasted corn, mesquite bread, and beef stew laced with herbs that no one in town could name. They called the place Heart Fire Kitchen. The name wasn't chosen. It was simply spoken one evening by an old rancher who said, "This food feels like it's keeping my heart lit." The name stayed. Silverton Crossing. The same town that once laughed at them, now sent wagons every Sunday. The men who'd mocked her lined up at her table. Some bowed their heads before eating. None ever mentioned curses again. Inside, the walls of the small cafe were the same rough planks Eliam had once nailed together for a barn. Only now they were scrubbed clean, hung with Apache blankets and carved wood spoons. And at the center of it all stood a long table that Eliam built from reclaimed fence posts, burned wood smoothed until it shone. He worked quietly at her side each night, washing dishes, fixing shelves, and listening to her hum as she stirred the stew. The song had no words, but somehow it filled the room with warmth that no fire alone could make. One evening, when the last customer left and the lantern light turned the air to gold, Talina handed him a small piece of wood. On it, she had carved words in a careful, deliberate hand, "Love is the fire that teaches us to see." Eliam turned the carving over in his palm, his thumb tracing each letter. "You think love can teach old eyes anything new?" She smiled softly. "If it can forgive what they've seen." Then yes. He looked at her for a long time, at the woman who had walked through flame and found him standing in the ashes. Outside, the wind stirred through the mesquite trees, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked soil and roasted corn. The next morning, he nailed the carving above the kitchen doorway. By dusk, its letters glowed in the firelight, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Travelers who passed through remembered it more than the food, whispering the words long after they left. "Love is the fire that teaches us to see." Years later, when strangers spoke of Coyote Bend, they didn't talk about the war or the burned fields. They talked about the ranch where the air always smelled like bread and sage, where a man once haunted by guilt learned to laugh again, beside a woman the world had called cursed. At twilight, they could still be seen sometimes, two silhouettes on the ridge above the valley, standing close as the wind moved around them. No grand gestures, no declarations, only the quiet understanding of two souls who had met in the ruins of fire and chosen to build instead of burn. And as the sun sank behind the Pecos hills, its last light caught the small wooden sign, turning the words into flame.